Alain Prost, 4 times a champion of the world, once described his greatest rival with a sentence that still stops a room. Ayrton, he said, has a small problem. He thinks he can't kill himself because he believes in God, and I think that is very dangerous for the other drivers. Martin Brundle, who fought him wheel to wheel before either of them reached Formula One, put the same idea in plainer words. Racing against Senna, he said, came down to a simple choice: get out of my way or have an accident. Gerhard Berger shared a garage with him for 3 years and went looking for a weakness. He never found one. In November of 1990, in a television studio in Adelaide, a 3-time world champion sat across from Senna and asked him, on camera, whether he had become a danger to his own sport. So who was Ayrton Senna, and why did the bravest men of their generation lower their voices when they talked about him? That is exactly what we are here to find out. Before we begin, if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe so they keep being told, and leave a comment telling us the first Senna moment you ever watched, live or long after. Now, to Britain, in the spring of 1983, where the fear began before Formula One ever saw him. Ayrton Senna da Silva was born in Sao Paulo on the 21st of March 1960 into a comfortable family, and his father put him in a cart almost before school. Nothing about the boy suggested menace. The menace was built lap by lap, an ocean away from home. By 1983, he was in England, fighting Martin Brundle for the British Formula 3 title, the last step before Formula One, and it was there, on cold circuits in front of small crowds, that the grammar of his whole career was written. He won the opening races so relentlessly that the season looked over by spring. Then Brundle found pace, started beating him, and the sport got its first look at what Senna did when he was challenged. He did not manage the points, he attacked. Gaps that were always going to close were taken anyway, and at Oulton Park, his car ended up on top of Brundle's after one of them closed. He took the title at the final round, and the men who raced him that season did not describe a rising star. They described weather, something that happened to you. A year later, he was in Formula One with Tolman, one of the slowest cars on the grid, and at Monaco, in a monsoon, the rookie was catching the race leader at seconds a lap when officials stopped the race early, with the gap collapsing. The leader that day was Alain Prost. It was the first conversation of a 10-year war. Formula One believed it had seen fast before. It had not. Here is the part of the story that does not fit a normal career. Grand Prix drivers measure themselves in race wins. Senna's true weapon lived one day earlier. On Saturday afternoons, when the fuel burned low, the tires were fresh, and there was nowhere to hide. In 161 Grand Prix, he took pole position 65 times. Not 10, not 30, 65. A pole every 2.5 weekends, sustained for a decade, against Prost, Piquet, Mansell, and Schumacher, 4 men who won 13 championships between them. The record stood for 12 years after his death, and one Saturday afternoon explains all the others. Monaco, May of 1988. Same team, same car, same afternoon, and Senna went 1.4 seconds faster than Alain Prost. In Formula One, 1.4 seconds is not a margin, it is a verdict. The television directors missed the lap entirely. 84 seconds of driving that people still argue about, and not one of them on camera. What frightened people was how he described it afterwards. I was no longer driving the car consciously, he said. It felt like I was in another dimension. The circuit was a tunnel, and I was just going and going and going. Read that again. That is not a man describing bravery. That is a man describing disappearance. By his own account, the lap scared him, and he backed off and came slowly into the pits, unwilling to visit that place again. That season, his McLaren Honda took 13 poles in 16 races. 8 wins were his, and the first of 3 world titles followed. Monaco fell to him 6 times, a record untouched to this day. But raw speed alone does not frighten world champions. What he was willing to do with it did. The proof came in the war with Prost. 2 seasons in the same team ended with 2 championships settled in the gravel at Suzuka. In 1989, they touched at the chicane, and the title went to the Frenchman in a steward's room. A year later, Senna drove into the first corner at some 250 kilometers an hour, never lifted, and took both cars off the road with the championship decided in the dust before the lap was over. Prost never pretended any of it was ordinary racing. He didn't want to beat me, he said. He wanted to destroy me. That was his motivation from the first day. When Prost fled to Ferrari, he made his accusation public, and it remains the most chilling thing one driver has ever said about another. He thinks he can't kill himself because he believes in God. Senna's answer was quieter and stranger than the charge. Because I believe in God, he said, it doesn't mean I'm immortal. I am as scared as anyone of getting hurt, especially driving a Formula One car. It sounded like a denial. It was not. It was a man agreeing about the stakes and refusing the conclusion. That November in Adelaide, Jackie Stewart, 3 times a champion of the world, read him the arithmetic on camera, more contact at with other cars than every champion before him combined. Senna stared at him for a long moment. "I find it amazing," he said, "for you to make such a question." And then came the sentence that became both scripture and warning, recited by every racer since and feared by every parent of one. "If you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver." The grid had now heard the philosophy from his own mouth. 3 stories show what it looked like at 200 miles an hour. The first is Monaco, race day, 1988, the day after the lap in another dimension. Senna led his teammate by almost a minute, and his own team asked him to slow down, to bring the car home. He slowed, and the moment the pressure eased, at Portier, the car found the barrier. There was no puncture and no failure. There was a champion who had been asked to drive below his own limit and could not. He climbed out, left the circuit on foot, and vanished into his apartment a few streets away while the race went on without him. The team did not hear from him for hours. "I was so close to perfection that weekend that I relaxed," he admitted later. "I invited a mistake." Consider the weight of that sentence. For this man, perfection was the hazard, not the wall. The second is Donington Park, April of 1993, in the rain. His McLaren was outgunned by the Williams cars ahead, and he was 5th before the first corner. By the end of the opening lap, he had passed Wendlinger around the outside in the spray, then Schumacher, then Hill, then Prost, and the television directors could barely keep him in frame. They call it the lap of the gods, and the name has outlived everyone who resisted it. He won by 1 minute and 23 seconds. Prost, in the fastest car in the field, finished 3rd, a lap down, after 7 visits to the pits. Senna stopped 4 times and treated a flooded circuit like a private road. The men he lapped that afternoon were world champions. The third is Interlagos, 1991, his home race, the one he had somehow never won. The gearbox began to die under him in the closing laps, until only 6th gear was left, a gear never meant for slow corners, and he held off the field in a wounded car with his shoulders and arms seizing with cramp. Rain arrived. He stayed ahead. He crossed the line screaming, and he screamed again on the podium because lifting the trophy hurt too much. He had beaten the field in a car that no longer worked, in front of the only crowd that mattered to him. 3 stories, 1 pattern. Now listen to the men who were best placed to judge them, because their testimony is the spine of this story. Gerhard Berger, 10 times a Grand Prix winner, his teammate for 3 full seasons, said it plainly. "I tried to find weaknesses in Senna, but I couldn't. He is 100% in everything." Berger went further. "He had a special concentration," he said, "better than any other driver. I was never able to do it the same way, and I don't think anybody else in Formula 1 could either." And Berger would also say something gentler. "He taught me a lot about our sport. I taught him to laugh." Years later, those words would be spoken again as a farewell. But the tragedy is already there, waiting 3 seasons ahead. Martin Brundle, who knew the weather of 1983 better than anyone, said Senna was always ready to risk an accident to make his point, and built a broadcasting career on explaining to the world what that willingness looked like from the cockpit alongside. The drivers who chased him through the spray at Donington reached for language that belongs in scripture, not in a paddock. Walking on water, it was called. And Prost, the man with the most reasons to diminish him, chose the largest words of all. He never wanted to beat me. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to show the people he was much stronger, much better. Listen closely to what the fastest men alive were actually saying about a colleague. That is not analysis. That is awe, wearing the vocabulary of fear. And then came the last weekend, the one where fear finally changed sides. Imola, the end of April, 1994. On Friday, his young protégé Rubens Barrichello was pulled unconscious from a violent crash in practice, and Senna was at the medical center before most of the paddock knew it had happened. On Saturday, a rookie named Roland Ratzenberger, a man Senna barely knew, was killed in qualifying. It was the first death at a Grand Prix weekend in 12 years, and it landed on a generation of drivers who had grown up believing that part of the sport was over. The most feared driver of his era stood in the medical center and wept on the shoulder of Sid Watkins, the sports chief doctor and his closest friend at the racetrack. Watkins told him the truth that everyone else was afraid to say out loud. "What else do you need to do? You have been world champion 3 times. You are obviously the quickest driver. Give it up and let's go fishing." Senna's answer has never stopped echoing. "Sid, there are certain things over which we have no control. I cannot quit. I have to go on." They were the last words the 2 friends ever exchanged. On Sunday morning, before the race, the drivers gathered and agreed to bring back their dormant safety association, dead for more than a decade, to make sure a weekend like this one could never happen again. The man they chose to lead it was Ayrton Senna. He had roughly 2 hours left to live. That afternoon, the 1st of May 1994, leading the San Marino Grand Prix from pole, Ayrton Senna left the road at Tamburello at full speed and did not come back. He was 34 years old, the broadcast never cut away, and a generation remembers where it was sitting. When they recovered the car, they found a furled Austrian flag inside the cockpit. He had planned to raise it in victory for Ratzenberger, a stranger, a rookie, a man whose funeral would draw 250 mourners. It would have been win number 42. Brazil declared 3 days of national mourning, and an estimated 3 million people lined the streets of Sao Paulo, the largest farewell any athlete has ever been given. Alain Prost, the man he had wanted to destroy, helped carry the coffin. The man the grid feared was carried through his city by the people who had never feared him at all. The records tell one version of the story. 65 pole positions that stood as the record for 12 years. 6 wins at Monaco, untouched still. 3 world championships, 41 victories, and 1 flag that was never raised. The men who raced him tell the truer version, and it answers the question this story opened with. The bravest drivers of their generation lowered their voices because what stood across the grid from them was not recklessness. Recklessness is careless, and he was never careless. He walked the circuits alone. He studied telemetry until the engineers went home. He knew the name of the risk better than the men who accused him of ignoring it because he had already done the arithmetic and accepted the total. What stood across the grid was total commitment, with nothing held back and nothing kept in reserve, from a man who understood exactly what it could cost. There was no bluff to call. That is what terrified them. On his last Saturday alive, his friend asked him to walk away, to go fishing, to grow old. He answered that some things are beyond our control and that he could not stop. Fear given enough time and enough truth earns a different name, and the men he terrified have grown old saying it. Reverence. The first corners of his home circuit in Sao Paulo carry his name today, and every Brazilian driver since has raced in his shadow. He said he had to go on. He went on.